On my 45th birthday, my family gave me a plastic trophy labeled World's #1 Disappointment. I smiled, thanked them, then cleaned up alone as they watched TV. Hey there, welcome to my channel. Today, I've got a story for you about a man who's going through a tough time facing the end of his marriage and trying to start fresh. Have you ever felt lost and had to pick up the pieces of your life? Stick around to see how he makes it through and finds peace again. And if you enjoy the story, please hit that subscribe button to help me reach 1,000 subs so I can share more stories with you. It was my 45th birthday, and honestly, I didn't expect much. Another year, another round of ignored texts, and perhaps a cake if I was lucky. But this year, there was a strange twist. My wife, Marissa, had insisted that I be seated at the head of the dinner table for a special surprise. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of excitement. Maybe, just maybe, they'd finally noticed everything I'd done for the family. The long hours, the sacrifices, the work that kept the roof over our heads. When I walked in, the dining room was set with the good china. Candles flickered, and my kids, Tyler and Sophie, were standing there with expectant faces. There was a cake, too, though it looked store-bought and hastily decorated. Still, it was the thought that counted, right? But the moment I sat down, I knew something was off. Marissa, with a wide grin on her face, waved her hand dramatically, pointing at the chair at the head of the table. "Happy birthday, honey," she said. Sophie, my 18-year-old daughter, filmed me with her phone. Tyler, my 15-year-old son, smirked in the corner. The moment was weirdly theatrical, and I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Then the gift came. Sophie handed me a small wrapped box, no bigger than a coffee mug. I unwrapped it slowly, feeling a wave of anticipation wash over me. Inside was a small, gold-colored plastic trophy about 6 inches tall, the kind you'd get at a dollar store. World's #1 Disappointment was engraved on it. I stared at it, frozen for a moment, before the laughter started. Marissa cackled, Tyler joined in, and Sophie zoomed in on my face with her phone, capturing every second of my discomfort. "Give an acceptance speech, Dad," Sophie said through her giggles. My throat tightened. The sting of those words hit me like a truck. I smiled, a tight, fake smile that I've perfected over the years. My heart sank, but I swallowed it down and nodded, pretending it didn't bother me. "Thank you," I muttered, but I could barely hear myself over the sound of their laughter. It wasn't the joke that hurt. It was the fact that they all thought it was funny. After dinner, while they were laughing in the living room, I cleaned up the mess alone. I thought about how, after all these years of hard work, I was nothing more than a joke to them. A man who gave everything only to be laughed at. The next morning, I sat in the garage, staring at my workbench. The faint smell of sawdust lingered in the air, and the tools I'd collected over the years gleamed dully under the dim fluorescent lights. I had built this garage with my own 2 hands, piece by piece, nail by nail, and yet here I was, sitting alone in the space I had created, feeling like a failure. It seemed almost ironic that the one place I could claim as entirely mine felt so empty. It was supposed to be a place of pride, a symbol of everything I'd achieved, but now it just felt hollow. Marissa had gone shopping with Sophie, and Tyler was off with his friends. For the first time in a long time, I felt the crushing weight of my own reality settle over me. This was it, the sum of everything I'd built. A house, a family, a garage full of tools. And yet I was drowning in a quiet despair that had been creeping in for months, maybe even years. I sat there in silence, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant sounds of the world outside, and I realized that for all the things I'd worked for, all the years I'd spent sacrificing, I had nothing to show for it. Nothing that felt real. Nothing that mattered. I hadn't really thought about what I was doing all this time. I hadn't taken a moment to question the path I was on. I had simply been reacting, surviving, living from day to day. When you're in the middle of it, you don't stop to ask yourself if you're happy, or if this is even the life you want. You just keep pushing, thinking that the next paycheck, the next project, the next holiday will bring some sense of fulfillment. But sitting in the garage that morning, everything hit me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't living at all. I was just existing. I wasn't even existing for myself. I was existing for them, for their expectations, for their needs. I was a walking ATM, a handyman on call, and an emotional punching bag all rolled into one. I had spent the last 2 decades of my life dedicating myself to a family that never seemed to see me. Or worse, a family that saw me only for what I could provide. I built things, houses, garages, lives, but none of that was ever enough. Marissa always wanted more. Sophie and Tyler always needed something else. They needed me to work harder, to make more money, to be available at the drop of a hat. But none of them ever seemed to notice when I was at the end of my rope. No one noticed the long hours I put in, the missed weekends, the trips I didn't take, the hobbies I abandoned. I was the guy who could fix anything, who could solve any problem. But the truth was, I was becoming a problem for myself. I remember thinking, why do I keep doing this? Why do I keep pushing myself, giving everything I have, when it feels like no one cares? I didn't even recognize the man I had become. The past few years had been nothing but work, work, and more work. I was a machine programmed to deliver, and I had done it well. I hadn't missed a mortgage payment in 15 years. I hadn't missed a shift in I don't know how long. I had taken pride in that, in being dependable, in being the guy who could always be counted on. But now that pride felt empty. The weight of all those hours, those years, hit me hard. My blood pressure had been through the roof, and my stress level was off the charts. I had no energy left. I felt like I was operating on fumes. Marissa, of course, suggested we downsize. Maybe we should think about getting a smaller place, she'd said one night, her voice matter of fact, like it was the most logical solution. I nodded, as I always did, but I couldn't ignore the growing resentment I felt. Every time I turned around, she was eyeing a new kitchen remodel or talking about a vacation she wanted to take. It felt like the more I worked, the more she wanted. And it wasn't just her. The kids, too. Sophie would ask for money for textbooks or some new gadget, and Tyler would beg for new clothes or a new gaming system. It was as if their desires were endless, and no matter how much I gave, it was never enough. I tried to bury the feeling. I told myself it was just a phase. Everyone goes through tough times, right? But deep down, I knew better. I had been stuck in this cycle for far too long. And the worst part? I wasn't even sure if they really cared about me. Sure, they loved me in their own way, but it didn't feel like love. Felt like an expectation. Like I was just the guy who was always there to provide, to fix, to make everything work. But no one noticed the cost. No one saw how I was slowly falling apart. Then that damn trophy. It wasn't just a joke. It wasn't just a stupid, thoughtless gift. It was a message. A clear message. You don't matter here. And it cut deeper than anything I had felt in years. I had been holding on to this hope, this idea that if I just kept working, just kept pushing, that maybe eventually they'd see me. They'd appreciate me. But the trophy was the final nail in the coffin. It wasn't funny. It wasn't a joke. It was a reminder that I had let this go on for too long, that I had allowed myself to become a shadow in my own life. As painful as it was to admit, I realized it was true. I had let it happen. I had allowed myself to become invisible, to become just another piece of the machinery, running in the background while everyone else lived their lives. It was time to change things. It was time to stop existing for them and start living for myself. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of something, anger, frustration, but also relief. Maybe I had been running on empty for so long that I didn't know what it felt like to be full of something else. I didn't know what the future would look like, or how I would change things. But in that moment, sitting in my garage, I knew something had to shift. The first step was admitting that I couldn't keep living like this, that I had to stop living for others and start living for myself. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be pretty, but I had to try. Knock knock. Now you're about to watch the best part of the story, but before that, make sure to subscribe to my channel so we can keep going together. I wasn't a man known for making rash decisions. I liked to think of myself as steady, someone who took his time to weigh things out, considering all angles before making any move. But that night, something clicked. It wasn't an overnight realization. But in the dark silence of that room, I finally understood what I had been avoiding for so long. I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I didn't want to just disappear. I wasn't going to fade into the background of my own life any longer. I needed to take control back of my life no matter what it took. The house, the family, the years of sacrifice, they didn't define me. I was more than that. I was more than their punchline. I was more than the invisible man in my own home. The idea had been growing in the back of my mind for months, maybe even years, but until then, I hadn't had the courage to give it voice. The frustration had been building like a pressure cooker, and that trophy, that humiliating plastic award, had been the last straw. It wasn't just a joke to me. It was a wake-up call, a loud, ringing alarm that told me I had allowed my worth to be defined by people who didn't value me, and it was time to change that. I wasn't sure what that change would look like, but I knew it had to happen. Now, the next morning I woke up early, not out of habit, but because my mind wouldn't let me sleep. I felt a rush of energy I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't excitement exactly, more like a combination of anxiety and clarity. A feeling that I was standing at the edge of a new chapter, one that would force me to let go of everything I had known. I knew there was no going back. This was it. I took a deep breath and got out of bed, moving quietly so I wouldn't wake Marissa. I didn't want any more confrontation. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about leaving her. It was about leaving the version of myself that had been stifled and unseen for so long. I needed to breathe again. I needed to start over. I walked into the kitchen, where the morning light was just beginning to peek through the blinds. I could hear Marissa and the kids still asleep in their rooms. The house was eerily quiet, like it always was before everything started. I grabbed my phone, unlocked it, and opened the banking app. I had been thinking about this for weeks, making sure I didn't act too hastily, but today felt different. Felt like the right moment to break free. I wasn't just trying to protect myself financially. I was protecting my mental health, my dignity. I wasn't going to let them keep controlling me. I set up a separate checking account, one that only I had access to. It wasn't about being petty or trying to get back at them. It was about giving myself some room to breathe, some space to exist without constantly being pulled down. I wasn't sure if I was doing it for the right reasons, but I knew it was something I had to do. I transferred what I could, just enough to keep me afloat, enough to start over without feeling like I had to beg for scraps. When I looked at the balance in my old account later that day, I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't about the money. It was about the control. For the first time in years, I felt like I was making a decision for myself, not for them. I wasn't doing this to hurt anyone. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was tired. Tired of being laughed at. Tired of being the punchline to every joke. Tired of giving everything I had and getting nothing but more work in return. This wasn't about revenge. It was about finding myself again. I made a few calls, one of them to Dave, a friend of mine who managed an apartment complex across town. Dave and I had worked together years ago, and though we'd lost touch over the years, we kept in contact sporadically. I trusted him, and I knew he could help me out. "Hey, Dave, you got anything available?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the nerves buzzing in my chest. "I need to get out of here. I need to make a change." He didn't ask many questions. He already knew. "I've got a one-bedroom place ready for you. It's available now. You just need to cover the first and last month's rent, and it's yours. It's clean, quiet, just what you need." I didn't think twice. "I'll take it." The words felt solid, as if a weight had been lifted from my chest. There was no second-guessing, no more time for hesitation. I hung up the phone, my hands still shaking, but I felt something I hadn't in years, a sense of empowerment. I had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I wasn't running away. I was choosing my own path for the first time in so long. The hardest part wasn't the money. It wasn't even leaving the house we'd built together, the place that was supposed to be a home but had become a symbol of everything I had sacrificed for nothing in return. The hardest part was admitting to myself that I was worth more than the ridicule. I had spent years thinking I had to stay, that I had to put up with the laughter, the disinterest, the contempt. I had become so accustomed to being the invisible man that it felt almost impossible to believe I was allowed to leave, to walk away, to finally say, enough. But I was done. I was done being their doormat, done being the one who always cleaned up their mess. I was done. So I packed a few things, nothing extravagant, just what I could carry with me. My tools, my high school football ring, one of the few things I had left that still meant something to me. A few old records, just because they reminded me of a time when things felt simpler. I didn't need much. What I was taking with me was more than just physical stuff. It was the hope that I could build something again, something that was mine. As I walked out of the door, I didn't look back. There was no dramatic goodbye, no final words. Just the quiet closing of a chapter one had let drag on far too long. The door clicked shut behind me, and for the first time in years, I felt a little lighter. I didn't know what was ahead, but I knew one thing. I was finally going to live for myself, and that was enough for now. I left a note for Marissa. A simple one, really. I didn't need to explain everything. I didn't know her that. It wasn't about justifying myself. It wasn't about getting her to understand. It wasn't even about seeking closure. It was just me taking the first step toward something I didn't know I needed until that very moment. The note was short, direct. I can't keep living this way. I'm leaving. I'll always be there for Tyler and Sophie, but I can't stay in a house that feels like a prison anymore. There was nothing else to say. I had said it all. For years, I had tried to communicate, tried to be understood, but there was always some reason we couldn't get on the same page. This was the last attempt, but there was no point in going back and rehashing things. Writing it wasn't the hard part. It was the moment I set the pen down, that silence in the room, the quiet acknowledgement of what was next. My stomach twisted as I walked out of the room. Leaving was something I had wanted for a long time, but the finality of it hit me in a way I didn't expect. There would be no turning back now. I slipped the note under the kitchen counter, where she'd always keep the keys to the house. Then I walked out the door, the sound of it closing behind me strangely final. I didn't feel any relief, just numbness, a heaviness in my chest. The air outside was cold, but I felt nothing. There wasn't anything left to feel except the overwhelming weight of doing what I knew I had to do. The next few days were a blur. I had expected some kind of reaction, but nothing could have prepared me for the chaos that followed. Marissa went into full meltdown mode. The phone calls came first, texts, endless messages asking if I was okay, asking what happened, what she did wrong. Her tone, frantic at first, grew desperate as the hours passed. She wanted to know if we could talk about it. She didn't understand why I had left so suddenly, why I couldn't just stay and work through it, but I knew the truth. We had been working through it for years, and nothing had changed. I wasn't going to be the man who stayed for the sake of a facade any longer. Marissa didn't even wait for me to respond. The very next day, she showed up at my old job, wearing a bathrobe, hair disheveled, eyes red from crying. The scene caught me off guard, but deep down I wasn't surprised. This was the woman who had always demanded answers without ever listening to the ones I had already given her. She barged into the office, demanding to speak to me, her voice shaking but angry. "Why didn't you tell me? Why the hell didn't you just tell me how bad things were?" she screamed, not caring who heard. My colleagues stood around, awkwardly pretending not to notice. I couldn't even look at her. There was no apology in her words, no regret, just blame. And that's what it always was, isn't it? Me trying to shoulder everything, while she deflected her own issues onto me. I didn't say a word. There was nothing left to say. I had made it clear that I was done. I wasn't going to be the emotional punching bag anymore. I wasn't going to endure her public meltdowns and make excuses for her behavior. So I didn't respond. I let her shout, I let her cry, but I wasn't giving in. That was the thing about Marissa. She never saw me. She never truly understood what I needed or who I was. To her, I was just the guy who paid the bills, fixed the house, kept things running. She took it all for granted, and maybe, deep down, I let her. But I wasn't going to be that guy anymore. By the time I returned to my small apartment, the storm was in full force. Marissa continued her barrage of calls, each one becoming more frantic, more accusatory. It was clear she was trying to make sense of what happened, but I wasn't interested in offering the answers she wanted. I had already given enough. The silence that followed the storm was just as heavy. I didn't owe her anything anymore. Tyler reached out, too. His message was less frantic, more confused than anything else. He wasn't mad, he didn't understand it fully, but he wasn't angry either. He didn't want to fight, but I could feel the gulf between us widening with each word. "Dad, why'd you leave? Are you okay?" he asked, his voice unsure, maybe even a little scared. We hadn't talked like that in years. His message was simple. "I don't understand, but I still care about you." I almost texted back immediately. I almost told him everything, but I didn't. I couldn't explain it to him. Not yet. Maybe someday, but not today. So, I kept it short, telling him I was fine and that I'd always be there for him. But it was Sophie who was the hardest to deal with. She was furious, and I don't think it was just because I left. It was more about her own confusion, her own sense of betrayal. I couldn't fault her for it, but the anger was raw, and it hit me where it hurt most. She posted a video on social media of me reading the engraving on that damn trophy, the one that had been the tipping point for me. She had filmed it when I opened it at the dinner table, mocking me in front of all her friends. The caption was brutal. "Dad's big moment. #fail, #dadfail, #disappointment." That stung. It felt like a slap across my face. Each word a reminder of how little I mattered in her eyes. Sophie had always been the one to push my buttons, to question me, to act like she knew better than me, even when she was just a kid. And now, as a teenager, she had gone and humiliated me in front of everyone she knew. The irony wasn't lost on me. Her acting out was just her way of coping with her own sense of abandonment. I could have reacted. I could have gone on there, posted something back, told her how I felt. I could have told her how much it hurt, how much I loved her, but how her actions made me feel like a joke. But I didn't. Couldn't let it break me. I had already come too far. I knew better now than to let their actions define me. I didn't want to play into their games anymore. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down. I wasn't going to give Marissa or Sophie or anyone the power to make me feel small. So I let it go. I let the video sit there, the comments piling up. The silence that followed was heavy. Every day felt like an eternity. I knew they were still processing everything, and I could only hope they would come to understand why I had to do this. But part of me knew it wasn't about them anymore. It wasn't about making them see things my way. It was about reclaiming my life, reclaiming who I was, and that, for the first time in a long time, felt like enough. A week passed, and things started to settle down. The world around me seemed quieter now. I had finally found a rhythm in my small apartment. The constant noise of family life, the pressure of expectations, and the feeling of always being on edge were gone. I had my space now, my own little corner of the world, even if it was just a one-bedroom with a kitchenette and a bathroom that smelled faintly of mildew. The space was small and definitely not glamorous, but it was mine. The first few days had been uncomfortable, like trying to sleep in an unfamiliar bed, but slowly, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. There was no more arguing over bills, no more pretending things were fine when they clearly weren't. The silence in my apartment wasn't lonely. It was freeing. The walls of the space weren't closing in on me. Instead, they felt like the beginning of something new. I could breathe again. In those first days, I found myself doing small things I hadn't had the time for in years. I started organizing my bookshelves, sorting through old records I hadn't listened to in ages, even making a cup of coffee just for myself at a leisurely pace. For the first time in so long, I wasn't living on someone else's schedule. I wasn't just existing, I was actually living, and it felt damn good. And then Tyler came to visit. I had been expecting it, of course. It wasn't like he was going to completely shut me out, even though I wasn't sure what kind of relationship we'd have now. He had always been the quieter of the two kids, the one who stayed in the background while Sophie took center stage. He wasn't as outspoken, but I could see the pain in his eyes when he came to the door, like he had been carrying it with him for days. But when he walked in, he didn't want to talk about the divorce or the trophy. He just wanted to hang out. That was the first sign that maybe things weren't as broken as they seemed. For the first time in forever, I wasn't just the provider or the punching bag. I was his dad again. I could tell he was trying to find a way back to that version of me, the one who was more than just the man who worked and paid the bills. We sat on the couch and ate pizza, talking about everything and nothing. He asked about my new apartment, if I was settling in okay, if I had everything I needed. It felt like such a small conversation, but it meant the world to me. I realized I had been so wrapped up in everything falling apart that I hadn't stopped to appreciate these small moments. Tyler's voice, his presence, felt like a connection to something real. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen. Not for what I could do for him or the family, but for who I was, a father. A man who was still trying to figure things out but was trying all the same. Felt good to have that. To feel like I mattered, even if just for a moment. And it was enough. One night, after we'd spent the evening watching some old movies, Tyler came to me with the trophy. It wasn't the first time I had thought about it. The damn thing had been on my mind more than I cared to admit. But this time it felt different. The trophy was cracked now. The sharp edges caught the light in a way that made me cringe. But there it was, the same stupid trophy I'd received for my so-called big moment. It still had the same inscription, World's #1 disappointment. Tyler didn't say much as he handed it to me, but there was a sadness in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It wasn't judgment. It was something else. Maybe regret. Maybe understanding. It's cracked, Tyler said, his voice soft. Sophie threw it against the wall after you left. But I saved it. He paused, looking at me. I thought, maybe you'd want it back. His words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with unspoken meaning. I took the trophy from his hands, feeling the weight of it, both physically and emotionally. I looked at the crack running through the plastic, the way the words seemed to mock me more than ever. In that moment, I realized something. The trophy wasn't just a symbol of what I had lost. It wasn't even a symbol of the humiliation I had felt. It was a symbol of change. Tyler's voice broke through my thoughts. Dad, this thing, it doesn't mean anything. It's just a stupid joke, right? The words stung, but in a way they also lifted something off my chest. He was right. The trophy didn't mean anything. It was a stupid joke. And that joke wasn't my life. My life was what I was building now. It wasn't about the things I had left behind. It wasn't about the things I couldn't control. It was about what I could still do for myself, what I could build moving forward. I looked at Tyler, really looked at him, for the first time in a long time. He wasn't angry. He wasn't disappointed. He was still my son. And for the first time since I left, I felt like I wasn't failing him. I was still a part of his life. And that was everything. I took the trophy from his hands and looked at it one last time, the crack almost symbolic of the crack I had finally allowed to form in my life. For years, I had held on to this ideal of who I was supposed to be, the provider, the protector, the guy who made everything work, even if it meant sacrificing my own happiness. But that was never who I was supposed to be. It was who I allowed myself to become. I set the trophy on the bookshelf right there next to my collection of records. It didn't need to be hidden away, but it didn't need to dominate my life anymore either. It was just a reminder that I had been broken, but that I was no longer defined by that. It wasn't about the trophy, it was about the message. It was about finally seeing who I was and what I deserved. I had spent so many years seeing myself through the eyes of others, through their disappointment, their expectations, their judgments. But now, for the first time, I was seeing myself through my own eyes. I didn't need to be anyone's joke. I didn't need to be the man everyone thought I was. I could be more than that. And I was. Tyler didn't need to say anything else. He understood. It wasn't about the trophy. It was about us. And we were going to be okay. Weeks turned into months. The calendar pages flipped like the chapters of a book I wasn't sure I was ready to read, but one that I had already begun. Marissa filed for divorce, and I didn't fight it. In truth, I didn't have the energy to fight anymore. My lawyer said I had everything documented, that everything was in my favor, and that there was no need to worry. I'd spent years fighting battles for people who didn't appreciate it. This time, I wasn't fighting anymore. I kept my word to Tyler. I was still paying for his internet, helping him with what I could, keeping a line of communication open. He had texted me a few times asking for help with homework or sharing updates about his life. Each message, each conversation, felt like a small bridge being built between us again. We weren't the same as we were before everything fell apart. But I wasn't giving up on him. He was still my son, and I would always be there for him. It wasn't about keeping promises to Marissa anymore. It was about being the father Tyler needed. The relationship with Sophie, though, was beyond repair. I couldn't ignore the hurt that hung between us. I understood it. I was the one who had left. I had broken the family apart. But Sophie, she had grown up too fast, and in her anger, she'd closed herself off. There were days when I wanted to reach out to her, to try and explain myself, but I knew better than to force it. She needed space to figure out her feelings, just as I did. I could only hope that one day, she'd see that I wasn't the disappointment the trophy had made me out to be, that I was still her father, and I was still trying to be the person she needed me to be. One day, while I was walking through the local hardware store, an old neighbor, Bob, stopped me. He was a guy I hadn't seen in years, someone who used to live down the street before I moved away to get married. We had always shared a few words when we bumped into each other, but he was never one to get too personal. "Hey, you're doing all right, huh?" Bob asked, a half-smile on his face. "Yeah, getting by," I said, nodding. He looked at me for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You really left them with nothing, huh?" The words hit me harder than I expected. Bob wasn't trying to start trouble. He wasn't even being judgmental. But there was a kind of finality in that question, a kind of accusation. I could have gotten defensive, could have lashed out. But I didn't. Instead, I just laughed. "No," I said, the smile coming out a little wry. "The truth is, I didn't leave them with nothing. I just took back what was mine." It was as simple as that, wasn't it? For years, I had given everything, my time, my energy, my soul. And when I finally walked away, I was just taking what belonged to me. My freedom, my peace, and the right to make my own choices. I wasn't leaving them to suffer. I wasn't abandoning my kids. I was simply choosing not to be the one who always carried the burden. That moment with Bob stuck with me. The kind of judgment we get from others is often unfair and misplaced, but it also serves as a reflection of what we've internalized ourselves. For too long, I had told myself I wasn't enough, that I was failing in every aspect of my life. And now, here I was, a man who had chosen to stand up for himself, to reclaim his life. I had no regrets about the decision to leave. None. And yet, hearing that question made me realize that I still had a lot to prove. Not to anyone else, but to myself. The divorce papers came a few weeks later. I sat at my kitchen table, the envelope in front of me, and for a second, I hesitated. But only for a second. I signed them without hesitation. The signature was the final step, a decision that had already been made long ago. Marissa was going to have to live with her decisions, just as I had to live with mine. This story is about reclaiming your life. It's about not letting yourself become a punching bag for others' expectations. Sometimes the hardest thing you'll ever do is walk away from everything you've known, but it's also the best thing you can do for yourself. And in the end, you find peace in the quiet moments, where you can finally breathe again. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to drop a comment with your feelings or feedback. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next story coming your way. Thanks for sticking with me and listening to the whole journey. I really appreciate it. See you in the next one.